Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on enhancing sponsor and site relationships. We're delighted you're here. My name is Angie Price. I'm the Quality Improvement Director for our site network. I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. A copy of the recording and slides will be available on our site network portal. The link to the portal will be shared in the chat and also at the conclusion of the webinar. Speaking of the chat, we encourage you to use the chat to ask questions, and our panelists will do our best to get through those questions throughout the webinar. For those of you that don't know, I act as a non-for-profit organization. We work with patients, sites, and pharmaceutical companies to expedite therapeutic interventions for children. We support a network of over 70 trial-ready sites by providing clinical trial opportunities, mentoring and educational webinars, and grants. We also work with pharmaceutical companies on pediatric clinical trial designs and feasibility, site identification projects, and initiatives to advance pediatric research. We're going to dive right in today with our topic, but we wanted to begin by looking at the changing clinical trial landscape. The landscape has been evolving rapidly by factors such as technology, increased regulatory scrutiny, and protocol complexity. There's also a growing number of pediatric trials. More trials mean there are more relationships to manage between sponsors and sites. This changing landscape has implications for both the sites and the sponsors. The need for communication and understanding between the sites and sponsors is prevalent now more than ever. Unfortunately, sponsor-site relationships can be strained due to lack of communication, unclear expectations, and competing priorities. Today, we are fortunate enough to have brought together sponsors and sites to discuss their common challenges and experiences and ways that they can navigate solutions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. We are fortunate enough to be joined by 2 sponsors and 4 site representatives. First, we have Mona Cichello. I knew I was going to do that. Cichello, a research clinical study manager at Novartis Pharmaceuticals. Next, we have Janice Sullivan, Vice Chair for the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Louisville and Assistant Chief Scientific Officer at Norton Children's Research Institute. We also have Myeshia Harmon, the Senior Administrative Director of Clinical Research Ops at Nationwide Children's, followed by Jasmine Kincaide, the Lead Clinical Project Manager at Bayer Pharmaceuticals. In addition, we have Elizabeth Nelson, the Supervisor of the Clinical Research Operations at Gillette Children's Hospital. And last but not least, we have Heather Tribout, the Research Support Corps Manager at University Hospital Cleveland Medical Center. We are honored to have these panelists with us here today. During our panel discussion, we are going to cover quite a few challenges and experiences conducted in pediatric research. We recognize it's impossible for us to address all of those challenges and solutions. Today's webinar is really designed just to get that conversation started. So as I mentioned earlier, communication and understanding are the most important things that we can think about when we talk about relationships. This begins with sites and sponsors recognizing that they both have separate realities. From this place, things can be seen more objectively. This allows both sides to see a different point of view instead of unquestionably believing that they're the only ones that know how to look at things. When we are open to separate realities, we tend to listen more, argue less, and find more creative solutions to our challenges. So that is kind of our goal today when we first get started, is to kind of look at first the site's perspective on the challenges that they're facing. And I would first like to have Dr. Sullivan lead the way.
Thank you, Angie. So I think as a site, we see increasingly complex terrain that really impacts clinical research. One of the articles that I looked at talked about there's been a 20% increase in oncology in trials that have 3 to 4 arms. There's been an increasing number of amendments for these more complex trials, and all that comes down to increased staff and PI time to do training, et cetera. So it makes that more complex. Complexity with clinical trials, the majority of the time relates to protocol, having a complex protocol, which may have increased number of procedures, increased number of visits, blood draws, or even pre-implementation where they may require an MRI, a test MRI to be sure that the procedure that your site is going to do is of the quality that it needs to be. The second thing relates to operations. And then the third thing is the potential for unanticipated changes. Other things that impact the complexity is advances in technology. Monitors now need access to the EMR to do verification of the information that's in the research record. Compliant or other similar programs to store regulatory documents. And then there are many databases that sponsors use that sites need to enter data into. And all of these things require training and passwords, etc. Then deadlines are another factor that can increase the complex terrain. And many times a questionnaire is sent to the site and it's like this, please complete this questionnaire. It'll take about 20 minutes. And we all know that the majority of the time it takes longer than that because some of the data that is requested is more granular data. And so the sites want to make sure that what they submit is correct, because this is how you begin your feasibility process, looking at, is this really a study that we have the patient population for, et cetera. So those questionnaires can really end up taking a considerable amount of time to complete. And then there's also deadlines related to budgets and contracts, et cetera. And then budget challenges, just working sometimes with the CRO rather than the sponsor can be a challenge, and we'll talk about that a little more later. But all of these, the complex protocol, advances in technology, deadlines, and budget challenges all impact site efficiencies and being able to move trials forward in a timely manner.
For sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Sullivan. And now, Heather, can you share with us a little bit about the challenges that we've had with resources at sites?
Sure. And I think it's a good segue into what Dr. Sullivan was saying. The resources we have, available to complete feasibility and study startup may not be the same resources that are available when it comes time to activate the site. So I think some, of our sites will struggle. Maybe the nurses that are working, to complete rapid study startup might be reassigned or working on another project when it comes time to open up the new protocol. Also, I think resources for the ancillary services and making sure that, we can get an MRI within protocol window, that has been a challenge for some of our pediatric protocols. Equipment, as far as, where do we store this? Research doesn't always have dedicated space. Trying to, make sure all of the equipment actually works. I know with a lot of our firewalls and Wi-Fi connections, some of the ePro diaries or tablets may not work how we need them to. So we have to involve, our IT teams, which can be pretty slow and then delay startup. And then just the infrastructure. I know because of the pandemic, a lot of our infrastructures and resources are constantly changing. People are burned out, and, with more work coming and still having to deal with all the work that we've been working on since 2020, I think it's been a challenge for sure for our staff, and trying to make sure we have, proper resources to support the trial when we're activated is top priority. But I think from a site's perspective, it's something we do struggle with.
Absolutely. And those are not new things, but they are continually bothersome. Myeshia, would you like to share about your site's challenges with patient recruitment?
Sure. With pediatrics, we've done all this work that Dr. Sullivan and Heather have talked about, but to do all of that work and then have time constraints because of patient recruitment is so tight. In pediatrics, you're trying to have parents that are trying to get their kid in the hospital to see all the things that they need to do for their children. And we're trying to utilize that small window to get patients recruited onto a study. So sometimes when we're not consulted or we get a study that's so tight, it's hard for us to recruit patients because there's only a certain window that we can get the patient on study, but they're doing so many other things. I think about times where we've had studies that need a 2-parent signature, and is that realistic based on the type of trial to get that in that one visit? So if both parents are not available, or the parent has another appointment across campus, we may not get that patient. So really working with sponsors and CROs to make sure that patient recruitment and that eligibility piece is conducive to actually enrolling patients on study. You know, we do all of this work to get the study open, and it's a shame that there's a tight eligibility timeline, or the eligibility is so strict that we miss those windows to enroll patients. You know, it would help if there's a group of folks that sponsors can consort with to see if this is realistic. Is it going to hinder us getting enough patients on study? Because the last thing you want is a patient or a study to close is because we didn't have enough patients to enroll, or enrollment was down based on either the eligibility criteria or time constraints that the study presents.
Absolutely. And, you know, that's so frustrating when sites give all their effort, right? And those things still don't come to fruition. So now we're going to hear from our sponsors. And I know that I gained a lot of knowledge by listening and working with our sponsors. There were things that I didn't understand. And so I'm looking forward to them sharing their perspective. I think a lot of times we, as researchers get kind of stuck that it's all their fault. And I think that this is not always the case. So welcome to our sponsors. We appreciate you joining. Mona, would you like to start us off?
Yes, I'd love to. Let's talk. Myeshia really said an awful lot of really good things. Our enrollment is our focus. And when we're looking at project management, we're always looking at how is enrollment going? What can we do? We understand enrollment is more difficult in pediatric studies. However, we may not know how difficult. And that's the detail that we need. That's the communication we need from the outset. We're going to be asking all the time, we want to know your activity, your pre-screening logs. We realize that this is a burden to sites. We're looking at ways in which to make it more electronic so that sites can also own their own data. But we need your participation to understand what's going on with our trial. Is it clinically relevant? Did something change last year and now you can't get those patients in? So all those things, the communication is really key in really understanding where the enrollment is going, and sooner than later. So don't hold back, just give it to us. And then all that is tied into site selection going forward, and then future trials. Your performance will be evaluated in that site selection in the past. So your communication, even if you were unable to enroll patients, that's really appreciated, and we would go to you again. And I'm going to lead it off. Jasmine, if you have any more comments.
Thanks, Mona. So maybe kind of continuing with the cost pressures that we have from sponsor side. So as a little bit discussed already, obviously the sort of the studies are becoming more and more complex as we are moving forward compared maybe to the things how they were 5 or 10 years ago. So it's really important that also the sponsors are taking some time in the beginning to really try to simplify the studies as much as possible and trying to make these as easy for the sites as much as possible. I know Mona is going to talk a little bit more about also the challenges with the cost pressure, and also understanding that in general the pediatric trials are more expensive than adult trials. So when the sponsors and CROs are planning for the budgets, they really should take this into account and making sure that the study budgets are really adjusted for pediatric studies. There are also other challenges that we have. So maybe something that is not always so visible for the sites is the regulatory requirements. So most of the time we do work in the Europe with EMA and with the US with FDA, with the regulatory requirements, kind of collaborating and negotiating about the pediatric trials that we are planning. So then all this comes also down to the deadline. So we do have deadlines also that we agreed together with the authorities, which sort of then we have to comply with, and also this then causes kind of additional pressure to all parties that are involved. But maybe this is a part that the sites are not always so aware of.
Wonderful. Well, that has been a very good way to start off to understand both perspectives. Now we would like to hear from you, the audience. We'd like to kind of get a pulse of what you see as the top 2 challenges. So we have put up a poll. If you would indicate the challenges that you seem to experience at your site, we will kind of go from there. Almost there. All right, well, in the interest of time, we're gonna go ahead and, oh, some more people. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share the results. I think that there's probably no surprises here. That resources and budget and all of these things probably are at one point or another a problem, right? It can vary study to study, sponsor to sponsor. But these are definitely the challenges that we experience, and these are the challenges that we'll be reviewing today and kind of talking a little bit about. So the good news about these challenges is that sites and sponsors are more collaborative and less adversarial. The industry has moved past the blame game, and they now look for mutual beneficial solutions for both parties. So we're going to begin with one of the biggest challenges and the most time-consuming process of budget negotiations. This challenge greatly increases study startup timelines, which neither sites nor sponsors want. So Dr. Sullivan's going to start us off with talking about those differences between adults and pediatric budgets.
Yeah, so trial budgets are not the same for adults and pediatric budgets. And as Jasmine said, typically a budget for a pediatric trial is more expensive than a budget for an adult trial. You cannot just take an adult protocol and everywhere there's adult, change it to child and run that protocol forward. There are a lot of things to consider in making that protocol and adapting it so that that trial can be conducted in the pediatric population. For example, one of them is blood volume. Particularly in the smaller infants, you have to use microtainers. You can't take that large blood volume that you take from an adult, etc. And when you're doing procedures in a pediatric patient, particularly the young patient, it typically takes more personnel. For an adult, I can draw blood from an adult and I don't need additional personnel to help me generally. But for an infant or young child, many times you need somebody to assist you in holding the child, somebody drawing the blood and somebody processing the blood. So it just takes more personnel, and all of that is going to push the cost of the budget up. So it's really important to justify up front with the CRO and the sponsor why you need additional funds to conduct this pediatric trial. So we really, as sites, need to educate those that we're interacting with in negotiation of the budget. And sometimes it's helpful to have a justification sheet written out, like, this is a pediatric trial, the reasons for additional costs are, and you list those so that that's something you just could give to the sponsor. And then many times, somebody already mentioned, parents have to, many times trials require 2 signatures. So both parents may need to miss work, etc. And so that really makes things more complex. One of the things we have done in certain trials here is include child life. So again, if you need child life to assist you with certain studies, that may require additional expense. So there are a lot of things that impact the trial budget. Patient reimbursement, we have a set amount of reimbursement that we do. We base it on an hourly rate for our population. So that's pretty standard for our studies. And then there just are other things that may impact the cost of a pediatric trial. So they may generally are more expensive than adult trials.
Absolutely. So we're going to hear from our sponsor about like what you've heard and how you've taken it in, and what you think about this perception from the sites. What do you think, Mona?
I think you're all correct, but I also want to tell you where I come from a project management area. We get cost analysis that we, as a sponsor, we pay for data. So we're only as good as the data we pay for. And that data may or may not be adequate when it comes to representing the pediatric population. It may have some adult information. Also, too, the assessment is based upon history of the cost analysts doing it and the time it takes to draw a patient's blood. For instance, it may take 10 minutes, and an adult, it may take half an hour with a child and multiple people. So as a project manager, when I see that the budget is much higher than what's given to me as far as my confidence, I need to ask questions. And so the feedback from the site is extremely helpful to get a more accurate budget. And, you know, we're paying for data. The data may be accurate. Sometimes, for instance, I was told by a site, don't, you know, invoice the data, make it real, because a lot of these these companies that sell us data will actually only look at the cost per item and not anything in invoiceable. So some sites, some companies get around that, and it doesn't help with the data that we receive. In addition to, we also know in pediatric studies, it's not the patient that needs travel, it's also the family, and maybe other siblings as well. So we look at that, we look at the way we can reimburse. You know, my sponsor actually has decided to, in the US, take on a concierge travel completely for all studies, and then also a credit card reimbursement, so that the patients get their money immediately, but the credit card reimbursement takes more work from the study coordinator. So we also have to make sure that your costs are covered in managing these things that we're trying to help. So I don't know, those are a couple of the issues that we just communicate with us, tell us where we go wrong. Don't be upset if the budget's much lower than you think. It's only the data that we get. Thank you.
Understandable. So I think that one of the things that I also wanted to get some more feedback from the sites is this reimbursement issue. I think that Heather had some good points when we were having this conversation, and I'd like her to share those with us.
Sure. I know for our site here in Cleveland, Ohio, we've had some situations for our pediatric trials where the sponsors completely refuse to offer participant reimbursements or compensation, and that significantly affects not only recruitment but retention, and also teeters on the line of being slightly unethical, because then it only allows participants that can afford to participate to be enrolled in the trial. So we try to eliminate, you know, bias selection and offer, you know, fair compensation and reimbursement for things done outside of standard of care. And it is applied to every, you know, protocol within a disease team. So it's fair and equitable. And there's been a few situations where we had to refuse a study at our site because the sponsor absolutely refused to allow it in the consent form and the budget. And I don't know if it applies to maybe laws and regulations outside of the US, or maybe there's a misunderstanding. You know, comparing sites to sites is not, you know, adequate either, because each state in the US has their own laws and regulations, and each local site may also have their own institutional policies that define whether or not studies can offer compensation and reimbursement. So I think if there's a better understanding on the sponsor's end or the CRO end that each site has to be looked at, you know, individually, then maybe we can, you know, continue to offer this instead of denying trials. But, you know, for parents, they have to take off work, or maybe they don't have transportation means. So we like to offer rideshare services or taxi or flights, especially for the rare disease studies. And then for the compensation, we do something similar to Dr. Sullivan alluded to, where we offer a flat rate, maybe not hourly, but based on procedures performed in a study visit that are outside of standard of care. So if we're having to do a scope for a peds GI trial, and it's above and beyond standard of care because they're looking at efficacy and taking biopsies, we want to make sure that there's appropriate compensation and reimbursement to attend that visit. I mean, those visits can be very long, 8 hours sometimes. And in order to get that data for the sponsor, we have to make sure that, you know, the participation is not a financial burden to the family. Otherwise, they're not going to show up to those scopes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think the better policy procedure understanding, it might be helpful.
Yeah, and you know, when you were talking about the cost, like geography can play a big difference. You know, if you live in San Francisco versus living in Orlando, like it can be a big variation. So Jasmine, I'm wondering from the sponsor side, like how does the sponsor determine what is fair?
I think really in principle, like you mentioned, that it should be based on the institution. So it really varies between the countries and sites, what is allowed and what is not. So basically that should be really the driving factors. And if it's possible, for example, that locally you're also allowed to give like meal tickets if the, like Heather was mentioning, that if your visits are really long, so think about the family, you know, how can you make the visits more comfortable? So anything like that that you're able to accommodate locally, that's really great to also bring up with your sponsor and CRO and make them aware. It could be that they are not even aware that that's possible in your site. So I think it's this awareness that is really important to kind of have these open discussions and understand what is possible within that country. So I think it's something that the patients and parents should not pay for the participation or kind of cover any cost of the participation on their own. So as far as it's possible and allowed locally, then that's something that should be built into the study budgets.
Absolutely. So the last thing that we wanted to talk about is amendments. I know that those can often occur before we even have IRB approval, right? We're planning study budget and we've already kind of redone an IRB submission 3 times. Myeshia, what can you share about the impact that has on the budget?
So depending on, you know, what has changed in that amendment, sometimes you have to go all the way back to the beginning and renegotiate and resubmit your IRB, and then work with all of those ancillary teams, depending on the nature of the amendment, to make sure that those things are still feasible. So, you know, we understand that sometimes things change, or as we're launching a study, there's more information that comes out, or another site is already launched. So there might be a change that they have identified that needs to go out to all the sites, but just understanding that each change has to go back through most of the channels, depending on the nature of the change that we've already been through. So that's going to add to your timeline to launch that protocol and to be able to get that new and novel research to your patients. So, you know, we understand that they're necessary, but sometimes grouping them. We have some consortium studies here that there may be changes that we just put on a parking lot, a long list of things that when we're ready and we feel like we have enough for an amendment, we'll submit that. Because if there's a budget change, that goes all the way back, you know, to our sponsor projects office, that you have to update the document. So really assessing if that protocol amendment is necessary, but it's not always adding things. Sometimes you're taking things away. So, you know, redoing our systems, making sure that if we're utilizing, for example, I've been in oncology for a long time, if we're utilizing chemotherapy and roadmaps, and something is taken away from an arm or is no longer valid, we have to go back into all those channels and systems and make sure that we're over communicating that this has changed, because it's not only a deviation if you don't do something, it's a deviation from a protocol if you do something that has changed, you know, since the amendment was approved. So over communicating, but amendments are necessary, but if they can be grouped and really looked at, if it's the nature of the amendment, so we don't have to go through all of the channels to get it reapproved. But again, there are some instances where that is needed and understandable.
Sure. Well, I knew we'd have a robust conversation around budgets. I want Mona to quickly share a point that she had made with us when we were having this conversation, and I kind of sheepishly was like, really? I didn't think about that. So if you want to share that.
Sure. There's sometimes when there are amendments that actually reduce the number of visits. So there's a reduction in work. So then the question is, what do you do? How do you negotiate? You know, from a sponsor perspective, we don't, you know, if it's something that's reduction and it's minor, we don't even renegotiate. But it came up, another thought came up, and that is your upfront costs. And there was someone was saying, you know, we don't really break even until we enroll 2 patients. And, you know, maybe look at your budgets differently. You know, there are significant upfront costs. You've got to get those in upfront, because now all our trials are going global. That means that other countries that are enrolling as well. In a contract, you may have a contractual amount of patients that you can enroll, but that's different to what you could actually enroll. So you don't want to lose if you can enroll more patients, because overall globally, there are enough patients in the study because it's competitive enrollment. So just keep that in mind when you're negotiating your budgets, that it makes much more sense to cover your costs at the time that they're incurred. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, that was a very nice conversation about budgets. I think our next common challenge is definitely around enrollment. So we're going to begin that discussion with Elizabeth. and she's going to share about some of the roadblocks that her site is faced with enrollment.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I think all of these conversation points show how interconnected each of these challenges are, but I think it also demonstrates how you can interconnect some of these solutions. A challenge with enrollment, with my organization, Gillette Children's, we work with many rare disease populations and complex conditions. So enrollment is on top of our mind. Whether it is a quick feasibility assessment that continues to shift following protocol amendments, changes to inclusion, exclusion, complex protocol design, and working with families to see what is realistic for you and your family to make the trip to our hospital for a full day visit or maybe 2-day visit. How do we also then navigate when there are changes throughout the study that could impact retention? We may have enrolled someone, but what if there are concerns with actually being able to complete treatment? And with that too, what about competing enrollment as well? How does that really influence our teams? How does that influence and inform our conversations with our CROs to really partner rather than feeling like this adversarial blame game at times?
Well, thank you very much. In the interest of time for the panelists, we're going to have to probably hurry us along a little bit. So I think I would like to turn to Jasmine. She had some really interesting feedback on the timelines and where those commitments come from way in advance before we ever even see the study. So I'd like Jasmine to share those.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I think, as I a little bit mentioned in the beginning, the challenge is that most of our studies are part of the Pediatric Investigation Plan with EMA, which is called PIP or PSP, Pediatric Study Plan with FDA. So these discussions really happen way before the first patient first visit or before the study is even set up. So there might be several years in between. So you can only imagine that trying to figure it out, I don't know, 3 years before the first patient first visit, how does that study design should look like, what the timelines might be, it's a bit of a challenge. And also you can conduct the early feasibilities, but then there's always the question that will the market landscape actually change in between? Obviously with pediatric studies, maybe it's not as fast as in adult studies, but still you have this challenge that things change in between. So typically when we negotiate the timelines and the study designs with the authorities, obviously then this is something that we are committed to do. Obviously, at times we also learn that by the time we are conducting the studies, things have changed. Maybe we need to do the protocol amendments because it's just not feasible anymore. So these are maybe the background information and kind of work that is done even before you get to see the studies at your site. We do tend to collaborate with a lot of with different investigator networks such as IACT to get some early feasibility and insight into our protocols just to make sure that they are as doable as possible in real life. And in addition to that, more and more, I think pharma companies are involving parents and patients, so patient organizations, when we are developing the protocol. So just to make sure that we do also consider the patient and parent perspective with our protocols as well. So when we have these documents and agreements with the authorities, the challenge is that usually we also have the timelines agreed. So there is also the reason why we have the timeline pressure to actually conduct these studies within certain time frame. So this is a bit of a challenge from that perspective. Maybe shortly mention about the particular challenges with some of the pediatric studies where we have the staggered patient recruitment. So obviously this is not in all of the pediatric studies, but especially those where you have like a wider age group. Typically you need to maybe confirm the dosing for the adolescent patients before you can move forward with the younger age cohort. So when doing these feasibilities, we typically see obviously that the older age groups are easier to recruit, and the younger we go, the more challenging it gets. And obviously for the sites, this is really a challenge because in overall, if you think in a dedicated patient kind of indication that what is your target population, you may have a good number of patients, but then when you start to put that into subgroups of different age cohorts, which you are only able to recruit at a given time point, that actually makes it much more challenging, and you only have maybe 1 year or 2 years time to recruit into that particular age cohort. Obviously for those studies where they're able to then at least leave the older age cohort open, so you kind of have at least 2 age cohorts open at the at the moment at the same time. So obviously this will make your recruitment much more easier if this is possible. So I think we all agree that we do have the challenges with the enrollment. Sometimes it's very difficult to anticipate how the enrollment is going to go with the study. And this is something that we really rely on the feedback from the sites to kind of get your input for our protocols and kind of the feedback, what is working and what is not working.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think it's just understanding there that sponsors understand where we're at, you know, and the pain that comes with, you know, a family that's in that certain age and they're waiting, and then that group gets filled up and you have to tell that family they can't participate. I think that that speaks to all of our hearts when that happens, and sometimes it's just unavoidable, unfortunately. So our next challenge isn't a new one, and we've touched on it a lot, so we might kind of just briefly recap it. It's definitely gotten worse since COVID, and that would be the resource challenges. This is the challenge that we experience with just kind of not having the staffing we used to have, having the resources. So I'd like to just kind of open that up to Myeshia, first of all, to talk about how that's affected your site.
Yes, you know, post-COVID, in COVID, pre-COVID, retention and reduced infrastructure and works resources has been a challenge for a lot of my colleagues. Our site is, you know, no stranger to this. And what that presents is that, you know, we do our best to, when we have folks turnover or what I have considered over the last year a revolving door, we're trying to get people in that are qualified, but also get them trained quickly and try to limit the disruption of service because we've had a coordinator or a nurse or a regulatory person leave. So a lot of times we hit barriers when we're trying to train these folks because our sponsors may have databases or other electronic things that we need to get them up and trained on. However, they've only allowed us to have one CRC or one nurse, you know, have access to all of that information. So we're trying to, we have a cross coverage model. So we try to get more than one person added to those studies so our PIs and our patients don't experience a disruption of service. But a lot of times, you know, the sponsor or the vendor may have limitations on that. So it doesn't always allow us to cross train and to cross cover because they may only have access to, that one person may only have access. So then we have to wait to the next monthly training or when someone is available. So, you know, really working with the sponsor to help us in our cross coverage model because we don't want to put studies on hold because we don't have the resources. And many of us have experienced that over the last several months.
Absolutely. So speaking of resources, we need investigators to do studies. So what's going on with that, Dr. Sullivan?
So I think it's more challenging now than ever to identify and recruit investigators who are willing to participate either as a PI or sub-I. And there's a number of factors that go into that. In the academic centers, many times they have less research time than they used to have. And some of them have no research time. They're on an RVU reimbursement model, which means that they get paid for seeing patients, and research patients are not part of that RVU model. And so that makes it really challenging. And then the other impact or thing that impacts with investigators, like for example, if you have an investigator meeting, our investigators have to give a 90-day notice if they want to change their clinic. So if you schedule an investigator meeting and they don't have a 90-day notice, it's almost impossible for them to get that time free to attend the investigator meeting. So all of those things make it really challenging. And I think there are things that can be done to help that. I think using nurse practitioners, and some of the sponsors now are allowing nurse practitioners to be utilized to help in seeing the patients, doing the physicals, etc. One thing we faced recently, we're doing a study, and the notification of critical labs will only be sent to the investigators, the PI and the co-investigators. They will not send it to the coordinator, which means if you have critical labs, the coordinator is the one who can really do something immediately and make sure the investigator sees it. So I think it's just challenging for the investigators to have the time they need to do the research.
Sure. So one of the questions we had, and I'm going to direct this to Mona because I know she has a good answer. Why can't sponsors provide the equipment and leave it So if they have, 4 studies and they're all with the same sponsor, why can't they be one EKG and we all just use that instead of having to store, multiple EKGs? What's up with that, Mona? What can you tell us about that?
Well, the way that sponsors develop their program is that they have teams, and the teams in the countries build the resources, and one would be equipment. So each study has someone responsible for the equipment, and so equipment is sent out for each study, and there's a start and stop date with that equipment. Now, the equipment is not something they can provide, they have to lease it. And so then the lease ends when the study ends. So there's tracking of that per study team. But Angie, I have to say there's some good news from where my perspective is my organization is changing so that there'll be a separate vendor person that could oversee the equipment for multiple studies. So therefore, one piece of equipment could be managed. But it's all the setup within the sponsor to see if they can, when they lease the equipment, manage the equipment, then also return the equipment. So it's all about that process. We should be much more accommodating to the sites because there's limited space. Thank you.
That's great. So our next challenge is technology overload. I know that innovations in technology are designed to improve our efficiency and our productivity, but they also raise training and regulatory issues as well as operational concerns. And I think that Janice mentioned earlier about, some of that challenge with having backup staff trained, and what can sponsors do about that, Jasmine? What can sponsors do to make sure that that we can, have the resources to have other staff trained?
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. So I think it's really important for the sponsors and vendors to basically look at those different vendors that provide these technologies, and then make sure that when they are providing the specs for the study, that this is really covered. So if these are just kind of very briefly reviewed, you don't pay attention to it, you maybe don't understand that they are actually not paying or covering all of the site stuff, or they are not covering the backup stuff as well. So that's also comes down to the sponsors understanding what's really needed at the sites. In principle, all sponsors should be kind of aiming for the fact that we always need to have a backup staff, because we know that with technology it's great to have, but if you don't have anyone to kind of manage it, you can just get stuck and nothing is going to happen at the site. So I think it's maybe sometimes a little bit lack of understanding that this is fully not understood, that actually it really needs to be built up in the specification documents with the vendors and then covered in the budget. So it's kind of to me, it should be a, let's say, quite easy fix to do, and then really allow these backup staff to be allocated in each of the sites.
Sure. So Elizabeth, I'm curious, how has technology impacted your site, in a positive way, or have there been challenges as well?
I would say both, and I'm sure I am not alone in that. I think, we've got a very tech savvy team. Our teams navigate, perhaps a dozen different systems just at our hospital alone, and then add in each of the systems that come with each study, each sponsor. And to everyone's point, both sponsor and site perspective, building in that backup is key. We really look at it from a safety and compliance perspective and data integrity. I think some of the successes is that as our technology has improved, we have much more, I'll say, complex but meaningful testing modalities. We're learning so much more with each test that we perform. But that being said, I think it comes with an exponential amount of complexity in terms of systems, passwords, multi-factor authentication, making sure Wi-Fi and compatibility are all working so that EKG data are actually transmitted to a sponsor. The amount of time that our team members spend learning, training, and then actually administering these technologies is significant. And I think to Jasmine's point, it's important to have that conversation up front and start building it into a budget. It is okay to acknowledge that challenge and say, how can we compromise to be able to use all these systems? And with that too, maybe a final thought. In time, I hope that we can see more of these systems perhaps integrating together. I know that's a big wish, and I know our IS folks, oftentimes shake their heads and say, no, it's just not doable right now. But I think it's worth mentioning. I think it's worth exploring to see, do they have to all be standalone systems?
Yes, I think that would be the gold standard, or the wish list of everybody. I walk into the trade shows and you just see hundreds of vendors and you're just like, that's a password. Every vendor I look at, I go, that's a password, that's authentication, that's a challenge. So Dr. Sullivan, I know that you've had some training challenges at your institution with parents and with staff. How's that gone for your site?
So I think it's critical. We had a big cyber event in May, and so that made some of our technology issues much more challenging. And so anything that interfaces with the EMR or anything that interfaces with the system here requires a lot more scrutiny because of the security threat. I think we've worked through a lot of this. I think COVID kind of pushed us so that, you can do the electronic consent, etc. I think we have made some real progress there, but I think you still face the issue in the more rural areas. They may not have Wi-Fi access if there are questionnaires and things that they need to complete on a regular basis. That makes it much more challenging and something you really need to look at because you really want those patients to be included in the research. And so you want to make sure that you do what you can and so that they can be included.
Sure. So Mona, what do sponsors think about all this technology? I mean, are they just as scratching their head about how to navigate it, or where do they go from here? What are their approach?
I think that it's just another piece for the sponsor to manage with their teams, to understand also, to have methods of training that if there's changes in staff, that people can continuously be trained. More of the time it's done electronically, and also then the clarification or the certificates are provided as well, things that are traceable. They make it easier for the sites to train. As far as the patients and parents, that also should be much more simplified. A lot of times we let the vendors come to us to say, this is how we're going to train, and we need to say more about their process.
So Heather, I'm curious, what challenges have you had at your site around training and just the experience of your workforce?
Yeah, training, I think, isn't as much of an issue as getting the equipment vetted and approved. I mean, we've even had struggles. We have a research IT team that is required to review every piece of equipment and or hyperlink software for each protocol. And I think the lack of, research knowledge and understanding of what the technology is going to be used for has been a challenge. For example, a central EKG machine. We have to repeatedly explain that this is collecting de-identified data, no PHI, and going to the sponsor. And we do that for hundreds of trials every month. So I think, trying to close some of those gaps and maybe even having a checklist or a cheat sheet from our sponsors that outline each device, each hyperlink, and how we're going to use that for the study would be helpful, so we can submit that to our, research IT team or IRB at study startup. I think that'll help, close some of the gaps. And then I think that could also be used for the study team to, keep track of all of the equipment and hyperlinks. So then when, it's a revolving door and we have a new coordinator starting, that could be a handoff, to the next person needs to come in and train, and they'll have all the resources and know who to contact for each website or piece of equipment.
That is wonderful. So I encourage all the sites to reach out to Heather, because that was just beautiful what she just shared. It's a very good solution to an ongoing challenge. So speaking of our next,
can I just make one note, and that is, someone had noted that they still have the same problems. Sponsors can find workarounds. If there's a challenge, we've had to provide laptops just for equipment to work. Because there's such barriers. The other thing that I've experienced as a sponsor is, it didn't work in the bowels of the hospital. It never worked. It was because the Wi-Fi that was used, the carrier, was not strong enough, and we had to change that. But we only saw that when someone from the vendor came into the hospital to see it not work. So, all those things. Be patient with us, but also communicate back to us. Thank you. Sorry.
No, that's great. That's a great point. So our next challenge is fairly new, and it may not have impacted your site yet, but it is coming. and that is decentralized trials. This is one of the, I think, the most significant changes in our landscape. In my lifetime, I thought it would never happen. I thought the IRBs were never going to go for this. So it's here. And, we're seeing a lot of increase and rise in these types of trials. And we recognize that they can improve accessibility and diversity and retention. However, they do not come without challenges. And so Myeshia is going to share one of the challenges that happen at her institution.
Thanks, Angie. One of the things that we have been encountering more and more and trying to put some guidelines around is home health nurses that are not our own home health agency within Nationwide Children's. So we had a situation where there was a trial that we were participating in, and the patient lived outside of our catchment area for our home health. And so we had to utilize the home health agency provided by the sponsor. And unfortunately, our patient did not have the best experience because the home health aide came, there was a car full of children outside, they came in a rushed state, and then proceeded to utilize a portable centrifuge of the blood sample that they had just taken on the hood of their car in the person's driveway. So imagine getting that call from a patient who did not have an optimal patient experience. Imagine having no recourse for said home health nurse because it was not our home health agency, is the one that the sponsor provided. So calling and giving that information back to the sponsor, not having a quick solution for the next visit, being at the sponsor's mercy, but also being pushed to be responsible for these home health agencies that we don't hire, we don't fire, we're not responsible for their training. So we're seeing a lot more of those cases and those scenarios where a sponsor wants us to utilize that decentralized service, but we're responsible. Our PI, our study teams are responsible for everything that happens on that study. However, we don't have any jurisdiction or oversight of some of the decentralized services. So we've really had to come together as leadership to try to figure out how are we going to approach this. Right now, we're taking it on a case-by-case basis and looking at what has to have one and where can we push back, but we're seeing that more and more.
Wonderful. Well, I hope that's the worst case scenario that we ever hear about decentralized trials. So we're fortunate enough to have Jasmine from Bayer here today, and she has quite a bit of experience with decentralized trials, and she spent some time talking with our team, really giving us a good overview about what we can expect with these types of trials. So Jasmine, would you like to share with us?
Sure. Maybe I just saw a question coming in. So basically what we're referring to with decentralized trial is some of or all of the aspects of the clinical trial are actually conducted outside of the study site. So I suppose nowadays, maybe the more common model is that we have like a hybrid option. So basically it could be that some of the visits will be at your site, but then maybe a couple of visits will be conducted as a home nursing visit, as was kind of the example that Myeshia just shared with us. Or it could be that the patients will be delivered the study trucks directly to home. So these kind of things. So it really depends on the study, what kind of DCT elements are selected for that trial. So I think it's less common to have the full DCT. Maybe in pediatrics, it's more common to have this hybrid option. So many times, kind of the sites and parents, they have the options to choose. Do they want to come to the visit, or maybe they want to maybe they live further away from the site, and having a nurse coming to their site is the more optimal solution. And then also having, for example, the study trucks delivered to their home. So obviously this is really something that is still new and is kind of the new kid on the block in a way that we're all learning as we move forward. Really depending what elements are used in a trial, you may have then several different vendors. So it's kind of just adding to the list of vendors that you're already working with. So in principle, the idea is that this is making the patients and parents' life much more easier. Everything is more accessible and easier for them in order for them to participate in the study. But I would say that honestly, for the sponsor and site perspective, it does mean increased workload. As Myeshia was explaining, there is still a challenge of the investigator oversight. So obviously, they still have the need to know what's going on with the patients, how they're progressing with the study, are they taking their tablets or medication as instructed. So there's still this need for, safety review, knowing what your patients are doing, and are they actually compliant with the study. So this makes it much more challenging. And I think learning from Myeshia's story, I would really like encourage those that are from sponsor side to have these detailed discussions with, let's say, the home nursing vendor to look through the specifications, because if it's a pediatric study, make the requirements that they have to have knowledge how to take samples from pediatric patients. So it's in a way things that we may not understand that are really crucial for the study, but we need to be very careful when we review those specifications and make the agreements with the vendors. So we need to make sure that they are really the right vendor to conduct these studies. So overall, I think it is a challenge and high workload for the sites. I'm hoping that the patients and parents are still kind of having a good experience and easier study participation kind of a path when they choose this route. But I think we still have a lot of learning ahead of us, and a lot of learning also for the vendors, because these vendors are, some of them have been around just for the past couple of years. So just the basic understanding of GCP requirements might be a challenge for them. So we really appreciate that if the sites have feedback and any recommendations, so please be open with your CROs and sponsors and share this with us as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for giving us that oversight. Like I said, some sites haven't gone here yet because there are a lot of challenges, but I do think that we owe it to our families to make this work so that we can provide opportunities to patients that might not be able to come to the hospital. So we're getting tight on time, but I don't think we could end today without talking about the elephant in the living room, and that's the CRO. So often they're the easy target, they're the scapegoat. There are, definitely challenges between sites and sponsors when navigating the CRO. So I think Mona was going to offer some insight into sponsors and CROs briefly before we move on.
Absolutely. I just want to say that, really CROs have become integral in the sponsor and getting the research they need done. But, there are contracts that they're restrictive and reporting at points. And then if there's an individual issue, many times it's up to the sponsor management with the sponsor to work with changing that or improving that. But sometimes that information doesn't get to where you feel it's important. And so I have a really good piece of advice. I was at a site once and they were just going through a lot of data cleaning, and I asked the coordinator, I said, what happened? And she said, well, we were talking to the study team and the clinical scientist said, is there anything else that you want to tell me? And she said, well, my monitor isn't coming and I have no data queries. And so that totally changed everything. So think about when you go to an investigator meeting and you meet the study team, the people that are responsible for the study and the quality of data are the clinical scientists and the physicians involved in safety. Know their names and know who they are, because they may be a way in which to explain what your issue is if you're not getting any response from the CRO and the sponsor manager. Sometimes there's just a delay that you don't want to experience. And so I think it's important, especially at the investigator meetings, know who your team is. Thank you.
I think that's a great backdoor. Everyone needs to remember that when they go to the investigator meeting. So we're running short on time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. But we did have to mention the impact that site networks have on the site sponsor relationship. We are positioned, site networks in general are positioned to help with communication, enrollment, and site education. They do, however, sometimes offer some complexity if the roles and responsibilities aren't clearly defined. Another issue is that they're different from network to network, so there is a bit of a learning curve. So we've reached the end of the hour, and in closing, I hope that you have seen that the success of pediatric research depends on collaboration and understanding between research sites and sponsors. Both sites and sponsors must continue to navigate the evolving clinical trial landscape by fostering open communication, aligning their interests, and working towards common goals. Today's discussion provided an excellent opportunity to address challenges and work towards solutions that benefit both parties, and most importantly, benefit pediatric patients. I want to thank the panelists for contributing their valuable experience and insight. We're appreciative of your time and your commitment to pediatric research. So this concludes the webinar, but I do have a few announcements before we sign off. I do want to thank Gilead Science for the support of our educational webinar. We're grateful for the commitment they have to pediatric research and giving us the opportunity to have these webinars. Next, we want to tell you about our last webinar for 2023, and that's building a culture of research. We're excited to have sites share across the network their efforts to build research, which has positively impacted them and really trickles down to improved enrollment. So it's really an important conversation to have. Please take a moment as you sign off, because people are signing off, to complete the feedback. We really need your feedback. We want to continually improve what we're doing. And most importantly, we want to continue to provide relevant educational programming. If you would like to receive CE credits for today's webinar, please reach out so that we can provide you with a certificate of attendance. You'll reach out to the site network email address. And we mentioned earlier, if you're interested in sharing today's webinar or getting a copy of the recording and slides, we will have those posted on the site network within about 72 hours. And then lastly, I want to thank the audience. We really appreciate your support for IACT, your attendance at our webinars, and your unwavering commitment to pediatric research. We're a special group. We're definitely committed in ways that other folks aren't with their work. And with that, we hope to see you at the next webinar, and take care.